family torn apart. Can you imagine that? Not by choice, but by force.
Yeah.
And their crime,
Yeah.
well, not adhering to the dominant religion, their punishment, enslavement.
We're diving deep today into a truly heartbreaking chapter.
Yeah.
The enslavement of Morisco children. A lot of you have asked for this one, so luckily we've got some incredible research to guide us.
Yeah, it's a story that really challenges our understanding of what was considered acceptable, back then. We're going to be relying on the work of Dr. Stephanie Kavanaugh.
Oh, fantastic.
She's a historian at Oxford.
Great.
And she's uncovered court records and personal accounts that really just bring this period to life.
I love when we have sources like that, personal accounts. It really makes it feel, real. Dr. Kavanaugh's research is so important because it gives a voice to these children who are often forgotten by history. These children, their lives were irrevocably changed because of the political and religious turmoil of the time.
Yeah, and it all begins with understanding who the Moriscos were.
Right.
So they were essentially former Muslims in Spain.
And their descendants, remember, in the early 1500s, they faced a horrific choice: convert to Christianity or be exiled.
Ugh, just a terrible choice.
I know.
And even though many of them did convert, the suspicion about their true faith lingered for generations. And so this distrust kind of fueled the events that led to their enslavement.
Exactly. That lingering suspicion became a very powerful weapon. So, following the Second Granadian War in the late 1560s, thousands of Moriscos, including innocent children, were captured and enslaved. And this was all under the guise of spoils of war.
Ah, spoils of war. Okay. So the Second Granadian War seems to be, a turning point here.
Yeah.
A pivotal point in this story. What were the driving forces behind this conflict? Was it purely religious, or were there other factors at play?
Religion definitely played a role, but it's not the whole story.
Okay.
So Spain, under the rule of Philip II at the time, was, a global powerhouse.
Right.
And they had ambitions of expanding their empire, and there were concerns about the Moriscos' loyalty. There were whispers that they might side with Spain's enemies, particularly the Ottoman Empire.
So their loyalty was questioned simply because of their heritage?
Sadly, yes.
Wow.
And to solidify control, the Spanish crown forcibly relocated up to 80,000 Moriscos.
80,000.
Yeah.
My gosh.
Which shattered their communities and further isolated them. So just imagine the chaos and heartbreak. I mean, families torn apart, people dying along the way.
Just unimaginable.
I know. And then to add enslavement on top of that trauma. How did they even justify enslaving people who were, at least officially, Catholic?
Well, that's where it gets really complicated. This wasn't a clear-cut decision. Even legal experts and theologians at the time were engaged in these really heated debates about the morality and legality of enslaving individuals who had been baptized.
So there was conflict, internal conflict, even within the Spanish establishment.
Absolutely.
But ultimately, the crown made a decision that would have devastating consequences. They declared the conflict a just war, which, in their eyes, made the enslavement of the Moriscos, including their children, permissible.
So they sidestepped the religious dilemma by using the war as justification.
Exactly. The rebellion, as they saw it, trumped their religious status. But then a few years later, in 1572, Philip II issued a law specifically outlawing the enslavement of Morisco children. So it almost seems like a sudden change of heart. Was there, a particular event that prompted this?
Well, it's not that simple. While on the surface, the law appears to be a step towards justice, the reality on the ground was much more complex. It's fascinating. This law, while it seemed, progressive on the surface,
Right.
it actually created a whole new set of challenges for these Morisco children.
You're saying that even with a law against their enslavement, their path to freedom, wasn't clear-cut.
Exactly. So imagine this, right? You're a child and you've been declared illegally enslaved.
Okay.
You would think, well, freedom should be automatic.
Yeah. But the reality is, these children now had to navigate this complex legal system to actually gain their freedom.
Oh, so the law itself didn't set them free. It just kind of opened up another battle, this time in the courts.
Precisely. And this court process was anything but simple. It involved families desperate to reunite with their children, lawyers trying to make sense of, a really convoluted legal system, and even individuals appointed as defenders of the Moriscos.
So Fingers of the Moriscos, that sounds like a medieval superhero title.
Right.
What exactly was their role?
It's fascinating. These defenders were tasked with representing the interests of the Moriscos in legal proceedings,
Okay.
and they used Philip II's 1572 law as their weapon,
Interesting.
arguing that the enslavement of these children was illegal.
So instead of getting bogged down in these debates about religious sincerity,
Right.
they focus solely on the letter of the law.
Exactly. It was a clever strategy. They sidestepped the whole issue of, were the Moriscos true Catholics? And just focused on the fact that their capture and enslavement violated the king's own decree.
Right, right. Like, we can argue about faith all day, but this is the law. Did this strategy work? Were these court battles successful?
Well, sadly, it wasn't always a guaranteed victory.
Oh, no.
The court system, you can imagine, was slow and prone to manipulation.
Of course.
Slave owners often appealed rulings, and that dragged out the process for years,
Oh, wow.
sometimes decades.
So even after a court ruled in favor of a child's freedom, they could still be held captive while the case was being appealed.
It's heartbreaking.
It's terrible.
These children, already traumatized by their experiences, had to endure even more uncertainty and separation from their families.
Ugh, it's just awful. And even if they did eventually win their freedom, it wasn't the kind of freedom we might think of today, right?
Exactly.
What do you mean? Were there limitations placed on them?
Yes, Philip II's law had a significant caveat. Even after being granted manumission, these freed children were required to serve in the households of old Christian
Christians.
Catholics with no Jewish or Muslim ancestry
Oh,
until they reached the age of 20.
so free in name only.
Right.
Essentially, they were still under the control of the very system that had enslaved them.
Exactly. It was a form of indentured servitude disguised as a benevolent act.
Right.
The rationale was that these children, they were considered vulnerable to heresy or rebellious tendencies because of their upbringing, so they needed to be properly raised as Christians.
It sounds more like forced assimilation than concern for their well-being.
Right. It was a way to exert control over the Moriscos, even after they had been legally freed.
Wow. And of course, this continued separation from their families caused just immense pain and hardship.
Absolutely.
Dr. Kavanaugh mentioned a story of a mother who tirelessly fought for her son's freedom in the courts.
Yeah.
What happened in that case? Were they ever reunited?
It's a story that really highlights the cruelty of this system. Even though this mother eventually won her son's freedom, they were not returned to her.
Oh my gosh.
They remained as servants in separate old Christian households, effectively severing their family ties.
It's difficult to even imagine the anguish that that mother must have endured, to fight so hard and then to have her family remain fractured.
Yeah, it's really sad.
Were there any stories of families who were reunited after manumission? Or were these separations just the norm?
Well, while the system was really designed to separate and assimilate, Dr. Kavanaugh's research does uncover instances where families defied the odds.
Okay, good.
There are accounts of communities pooling their resources to ransom their captured members.
So they were literally buying back their freedom.
It's an incredible act of collective resistance.
It really is. Imagine the level of organization and the trust involved to make that happen.
Exactly. And it wasn't just individual families scraping together what they could.
Right.
They had systems for raising and distributing funds, specifically for this purpose.
It's a testament to the strength of their community, even in the face of such adversity.
Absolutely.
They weren't just accepting their fate, they were actively trying to change it.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about how this ransoming system worked?
So ransoming, it has a long history, going back centuries, and it took on various forms.
Yeah.
But in this case, it involved Morisco communities pooling their resources, often through these clandestine networks to negotiate the release of their captured members.
Well, it's almost like an underground railroad operating in secrecy to counter these oppressive forces working against them.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how many more of these stories are hidden in the historical records, just waiting to be uncovered.
That's the power of historical research, isn't it? Challenging the dominant narratives and giving voice to those who've been silenced.
For sure. And Dr. Kavanaugh's work is such a prime example of this. By digging deep into those court records and personal accounts, she's shed light on a truly just, harrowing chapter of history. And it's a chapter that has relevance beyond just the specific events of 16th century Spain.
Right.
We've talked about the court cases, the limitations of manumission, the efforts to ransom the captured Moriscos. But how does this story connect to the broader context of slavery? in the Spanish Empire?
Well, that's a crucial question.
Yeah.
The enslavement of the Moriscos wasn't an isolated incident.
Right.
It was part of this much larger system of exploitation and oppression that fueled Spain's rise as a global power.
So they were enslaving other populations as well?
Sadly, yes, indigenous populations in the Americas, Africans transported across the Atlantic, slavery was a cornerstone of Spain's economic and political dominance.
Wow.
And the justifications they used to enslave these groups often mirrored those used against the Moriscos.
You're saying that they used similar tactics, similar rationalizations to justify the enslavement of different groups, even though the circumstances were so different.
Precisely. The idea of religious difference, the notion that certain groups were inherently inferior and therefore deserving of enslavement, these were recurring themes in the rhetoric used to legitimize the practice.
So while the Morisco story is unique in its specific details, it's part of a much larger and really deeply unsettling narrative of just dehumanization and exploitation.
Absolutely.
It's a sobering reminder that the quest for power often comes at a terrible human cost.
Yes, and it's a reminder that we need to be vigilant in challenging these systems of oppression,
Well said.
wherever they may exist.
The Morisco story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it's also a stark warning about the dangers of prejudice and intolerance. What do you think, listener? What stands out to you about this deep dive?
It really is a lot to process, you know? This
Yeah.
idea that Spain was having these internal debates about, whether it was okay to enslave baptized people. But at the same time, they were building an empire on the backs of enslaved indigenous people and Africans. It speaks to like a real hypocrisy at the heart of their society.
Yeah, and this hypocrisy is something that Dr. Kavanaugh really explores in her research. She points out that, the justifications they used to enslave different groups were often contradictory and really self-serving. It all boils down to like power and control.
It makes you wonder about the long-term consequences for the Moriscos. I mean, we've talked about their fight for freedom, the challenges they faced even after manumission. But did those who were freed, especially the children, did they actually assimilate into Catholic life like Philip II wanted? That's a great question, and it's one that historians are still kind of debating. It's hard to say for sure how, individuals navigated their identities after going through such trauma. Some may have outwardly conformed to Catholicism just to survive, while others might have clung to their Morisco heritage in secret.
It's like they were trapped between two worlds, forced to make impossible choices.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that even for those who did convert, true acceptance was never guaranteed. The concept of purity of blood, this idea that old Christians were somehow racially superior, it really permeated Spanish society for centuries.
So even conversion wasn't enough to erase the stigma.
Sadly, no. And it's a stark reminder that prejudice and discrimination can, persist long after laws are changed or policies are enacted. The wounds of the past can take generations to heal.
This whole deep dive has been so eye-opening, but it's also been incredibly sad. These stories of families being ripped apart, children forced into servitude, it's truly heart-wrenching.
It is, and it's crucial to remember that these weren't just statistics or historical footnotes. These were real people, with lives, dreams, families. Their stories deserve to be heard and remembered.
Absolutely, and Dr. Kavanaugh's work does a remarkable job of giving voice to these, often forgotten individuals.
Right.
She helps us understand the human cost of these events.
And her research also reminds us that history is rarely, a simple narrative of good versus evil. There are complexities, contradictions, unintended consequences that we need to really grapple with if we want to understand the past.
It's by, understanding the past that we can learn from it and hopefully avoid repeating those same mistakes.
I completely agree. History isn't just about looking back. It's about informing the present, and shaping a better future.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the enslavement of Morisco children, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will carry with them?
I think the most important thing is to remember the power of resilience and, the importance of empathy. Despite unimaginable hardship, the Moriscos fought for their freedom, their families, their cultural identity. Their stories should inspire us to stand up against injustice, and to advocate for those who are marginalized and oppressed.
Beautifully said. And their stories serve as, a powerful reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the importance of challenging systems of discrimination wherever we see them.
Absolutely. We must learn from the mistakes of history and work towards creating a more just and equitable society for all.
Well said. And listener, if you found this deep dive into this, little-known chapter of history as fascinating as we did, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more, thought-provoking explorations of the past. We'll be back soon with another episode that's sure to spark your curiosity. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.